The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
The most important thing President Biden can do during the remainder of his term is resign or retire, at least according to some major new polling. With his numbers way underwater, although not as bad as Vice President Kamala Harris's popularity, it seems that Joe Biden just can't catch a break. The question America is asking, though, is does he even deserve one? There's a saying that goes, if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail, or as British wartime Prime Minister Winston Churchill once said, plans are of little importance, but planning is essential. It seems that this administration is drowning in its own lack of forward planning. In place of strategy, it has opted for showmanship and pretty sweet words. As an energy crisis looms, the president mulls shutting down essential oil pipelines, while at the same time begging OPEC to ramp up output. VP Kamala Harris wanders off to Europe to lecture folks about their immigration crisis, while steadfastly refusing to admit that at least 1.75 million illegal immigrants came across the southern border this year, resembling a crisis. And what of Mayor Pete Buttigieg, now Transport Secretary, who spends his time discussing racist roads and how best to ensure bridges are high enough to eradicate the dark history of prejudice, all while container ships sit off the coast unable to supply Americans of all colors with the essential goods they need. This is more than a lack of planning. It represents an inability to think beyond the next, almost certainly disastrous, popularity poll. Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. Now, on today's show, we're going to town on the future of the Republic under Joe Biden, fading popularity and all, and in what direction is the land of the free heading? I'd like to say a special hello to our listeners on KNTR 106.3 FM out of Lake Havasu City, Arizona. We appreciate you. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news and analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Let's get started. In politics, it's all too easy to get caught up in the day-to-day minutiae while ignoring the grander scale trends that seem to be emerging. Our 24-hour news cycle feeds on the new news and disregards the big picture in favor of pre-packaged sound bites and salacious headlines. But are we missing the woods for the trees? Well, one such fellow who's always been able to see through the morass and brings much-needed perspective is nationally syndicated columnist and prolific author, Mr. Cal Thomas, who once again joins us to dive deep into the reality facing Americans and American politics. Thanks for being here, Cal.
Always a pleasure, Mark. Thank you.
So, Cal, the latest polling, it shows Joe Biden's approval is in deep water, and even a majority of Americans don't think he's in control of his own presidency. Now, we have 3 more years of President Joe ahead of us. What kind of impact do you think this distrust at the top politician in the country will have on the psyche of the American voter?
Well, as you indicate, the poll numbers have been falling consistently since he was inaugurated. A lot of this, of course, is the reaction to Donald Trump, who a great number of people didn't like because of his personality that overwhelmed his policies. I think the real problem in the United States, Mark, and it may be a problem in other Western countries too, but especially here, is that people don't realize that a constitutional republic has to be renewed every generation, or we risk losing it. People don't take the time to actually look into issues and solutions that have worked in the past, update them as necessary, and move on to the future. They're lazy. It's like watching an exercise video thinking you can get in shape instead of actually going to the gym or running. You can't let somebody else do it for you. You have to do it for yourself. As we've seen in our American public schools, the teaching of civics has almost disappeared. People don't understand or even read or know what's in the Constitution. This is very, very dangerous. And so they vote on feelings or party loyalty or other factors that have absolutely nothing to do with the issues at hand. I've been going through some past columns of mine, and as I'm writing a book on my nearly 40 years as a syndicated columnist, and I'm looking at comments from politicians of the past. They're all recycled. They say the same thing. The rich need to pay their fair share. Nobody ever talks about personal responsibility. It's all about the politicians and about the government. And that is why we are in trouble with an absent border, with people who are absent from the political system, and people who have checked out on things that really matter in favor of envy, greed, and entitlement and what I can get for myself from the government.
Yeah, it's Ecclesiastes, I believe, isn't it? There's nothing new under the sun, and all this has happened before. And
right.
As you point out, there are no new solutions, which is a question that's, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that actually brings me to a question that I have for you later on that should be interesting to do with Athenian democracy and how it pertains to today. But my next question is, we see with Joe Biden, he's put activists in charge in just about every position of importance. And we know that activists, they're willing to achieve their pet goals by pretty much any means necessary. All must fall before the greater good of their cause, even to the point of trashing the Constitution. Now, that's how and why they're activists. Now, is this a wholesale decimation of the institutions that cobbled together create what we call the United States? And is this being done with purpose, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I don't think there's any question. Biden has been kind of a reverse Trojan horse. He is occupied mentally and in every other way by the hardcore left. The hardcore left in America knows it can't win elections on its own. So it puts up people like Barack Obama and to a certain extent Bill Clinton and other Democrats running for Congress, with a few exceptions like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, who are openly socialist. And they try to push these through as moderates. You hear in the American media all the time the word moderate. Joe Manchin is a moderate. One or two others are moderates, but you never hear the media defining that. What does that mean? Just spending maybe $500 billion less than the other guys? They're still pro-choice on abortion. Marry anybody you want, or as many people as you want. Truth is no longer objective. It's subjective. It's whatever I think. If you think something different, it's okay as long as it makes you happy. So, we've abandoned Thomas Jefferson, who's about to be thrown out of the New York City Council chambers, by the way, because he owned slaves, who spoke of we hold these truths to be self-evident. That whole philosophy has evaporated in America today. There is no objective truth. And that's why I think whether it's immigration or virtually anything else, including spending and the debt, the Democrats used to be against the debt. They say we're imposing something on our grandchildren that cannot be sustainable. But now they're fine with it. So what changed? Did their grandchildren change? Did economic reality change? No, only they changed. And they know the more people they addict to so-called benefits, which are jammed into this new so-called infrastructure and social spending legislation that is now being debated in Congress, the more they get addicted to government, the more they can rely on votes to perpetuate their careers in office. And that's what it's really all about.
Well, yeah, you never vote to get rid of the guy who's giving you money.
There you go.
That's the reality of it. So let's go to the longer term here, Cal. Where do you see the political landscape by 2024? Now, I'm not just talking about who wins or who loses elections, but the state of the body politic.
Well, I think a lot of it depends on what happens in the congressional races next year. If the Republicans run on stopping the socialist train, if they run on with superior ideas, the late Jack Kemp had a great line. He said, you don't beat a thesis with an antithesis, you beat it with a better thesis. That's why Ronald Reagan's great line, are you better off than you were 4 years ago, resonated with so many people. People see the cost of petrol, of eggs, of bread, of virtually everything going up, a consequence of inflation and deficit spending and huge national debt. So they're feeling this at the most personal of levels. at the supermarket, at the petrol pump, at virtually every other area that touches every life in America. So I think if Republicans can make this case, which is an obvious case, they will do very well next year. And then in 2024, of course, it all depends on what Donald Trump does. He is the key factor. If he runs, I think he's going to divide the party. I can't imagine that he won't run if he remains in decent health. But there are plenty of others out there. Ron DeSantis has done a fabulous job as governor of Florida, which is one of the reasons the left continues to beat up on him. Mike Pence, I think, has got the whole package, but unfortunately, he's so tied to Trump, I don't know if he can escape that association. But he believes in everything Trump did on policies. He just has a completely different personality. He would be my ideal candidate. And then anybody can surface in the next 2 years, and probably will.
You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio. Later in the show, we're going for a deep dive on Biden's falling numbers and what it means in real terms. But right after this short break, we're back with national treasurer and widely syndicated columnist Cal Thomas.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
All right, Cal, we see a lot of folks in the Democratic Party that they're stepping down ahead of the 2022 congressional elections. Yeah. Mostly these are safe seats, of course, so there's no major issue for the Democrats here. But I think, and I guess many other people also think that the way this administration is going, relying on the strictly party line votes that they have been so far to get pretty much anything done, that we're going to see a lot more folks from both parties step down in the near future, because most of these people, they didn't get into politics to spend their time in constant bickering and competition, having to, let's call it, throw away the last of their remaining principles to bolster a party. They went to DC to work for their constituents and to get rich. Just kidding, yeah. Sort of. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's true. I wrote recently, how do some of these people come to Washington as thousandaires and leave millionaires when they're getting a salary of roughly $175,000 a year? You got lobbyists in there with free things and free food and travel and all sorts of other things. It's corrupting. I mean, there was a columnist years ago, Jack Anderson, who wrote a column called the Washington Merry-Go-Round. And then there was another columnist that talked about, whether it was Potomac, something. Anyway, Trump touched on this when he spoke about the swamp. And it is a swamp, and it is corrupting because as soon as you get there, you have to start raising money for your next campaign. And you sell off pieces of your soul to various interest groups to do that. It's incredibly corrupting. This is why the founders never expected politics to be a career. They were people coming from their law offices, from businesses, from farms to serve their country for a limited time. George Washington being the model for that. He could have run for a third term, but he went home to Mount Vernon. Could have easily won. And they didn't expect these guys to become career politicians. This is why term limits are so necessary. I may have told you this story before. George McGovern, 1972 presidential candidate in the Democrat ticket, friend of mine, senator from South Dakota, lost in the Reagan landslide of 1980 and decided to do something totally different, went up to Connecticut and bought an inn and tried to run it. It went bankrupt after a couple of years, and the Wall Street Journal called him up, want to know what happened. And then the only thing you need to know about what happens to politicians when they stay too long in Washington, George McGovern said, gee, if I'd known how difficult it was to run a business, I might have voted differently in the Senate. And that says all you need to know about people who stay too long in Washington.
Right, that brings us nicely on to the question that I referred to earlier. So I want to take a little step back in time. Now, as you know, when ancient Athens sort of came into its own, first through the reforms of Solon, and then I think it was Clisthenes, who became known as the father of Athenian democracy. Now, that was considered this grand experiment, one that sought to give each household in the city-state a voice. And here's the thing. The laws, they were written in plain language in public squares so that every man, woman, and child, those who knew their letters, could read and understand them. And today we have a constitution and a Bill of Rights that I find quite interesting and easy to read. It's very simple. It lays out what this is what things should be, and these are what your rights are, and this is how they're protected. But it seems that now it requires an army of lawyers and politicians to explain the subtleties and to argue over the subtleties of why rights that we thought were enshrined, that's just not so. And it seems that America is straying very much from this Athenian and of course, the Roman influence faster day by day. So how do we stop the piecemeal destruction of the nation's founding documents?
Well, again, it goes back to education and what is being taught in our schools and the next generation of people who are going to lead this country or any Western country for that matter. You mentioned the Greeks, John Knox, the founders of this country, all believed that power flowed from the people and that government was instituted among men and women for the purposes of promoting the general welfare, not the individual welfare of politicians. But today, especially in the United States, power is seen as coming from the top. You look at these vaccine mandates, you look at these federal regulations everywhere. You take an airplane ride, there's 10 minutes of safety and federal regulation announcements, including not messing with a smoke detector in the bathroom, keeping your mask on at all times unless you are sipping a drink or eating food, and then you're supposed to replace the mask while you're swallowing, I guess. Nobody says, well, if the virus is there and sees you drinking and eating, is it not going to invade your body? It's all theater. It's manufactured by government elites who want to increasingly have control of our lives and individual decisions. This is completely contrary to the Constitution. We have a 10th Amendment for a purpose, and it says, as I'm paraphrasing, all rights not specifically granted to the federal government shall be reserved for the individual states and for the people. That is completely ignored now. Bob Dole, a former senator and presidential candidate, used to carry that 10th Amendment around in his pocket and remind people of it. But now with the government serving like an ATM, doling out goodies to everybody, entitlements, benefits, you hear them on the commercials. We have open season now on Medicare. And the television stations and networks are flooded with Medicare supplement ads. Every single one of them contains the words entitled and benefit. And those are code words for envy, greed, and entitlement. I deserve things. Oh, that's the other word, deserve. I deserve the benefit and the entitlement. The unholy trinity.
Yeah, with the flights, I avoid the issue with removing the mask because I drink Bloody Marys constantly. All throughout the entire, it doesn't matter how long the flight is, because it's the tomato juice. It's better for you because you get the flavor, because there's a difference in flavor taste when you're at higher altitude.
I'm with you. That's good.
Carl Thomas, we'll leave it on that. Thank you ever so much for joining me.
Thank you, Mark.
You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard across the Radio America network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. And remember, you can tune in for Liberty Nation Radio from 2 to 3 p.m. Sunday on KBKW 103.5 FM, 1450 AM, the talk of Grays Harbor. Coming up soon on the show, we'll be talking liberty and dissecting the crowd crusher Travis Scott's Astro World Festival. But next up, we're meeting Tim Donner to figure out how Biden's numbers went from bad to worse. Don't touch that dial.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear for your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
The numbers are in and they don't bode well for President Joe Biden. this most precipitous fall in popularity, not only for his job approval, but for his handling of just about every issue. And yet, we have 3 long years ahead. Well, to paint a picture of what that particular dark winter might look like, we're joined by longtime host of this here Liberty Nation Radio and senior political analyst for LibertyNation.com, Mr. Tim Donner. Welcome back, Tim.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
Now, I have to say, I'm stunned by how this turned around so quickly. Us political pundits, we knew it would be bad, but I think we're experiencing a case of political whiplash here. How bad is it for President Biden?
Well, it sounds like you're setting me up for a Johnny Carson. How bad is it? Late night talk show. Well, it's so bad, Mark, that Joe Biden may not even be aware of it, which is a problem that's only going to get worse because his cognitive decline becomes more obvious with each passing day. And unfortunately, the physical ills, the inability to, shall we say, control his bodily functions is now even an issue. So it has fallen apart for this presidency faster than I even imagined. And I imagined it would fall apart pretty fast because he seems not at all in control of what's going on in his administration. He's unable to navigate a 50-50 Senate. He's unable to navigate a narrow majority in the House. And I think his biggest problem, just in terms of politically, Mark, is that he sided with the progressives after being elected as a moderate. So he's picked the wrong horse, and it's obvious, even with this reconciliation bill that's eventually going to pass, it's not going to be anything near what he had hoped in his somehow utopian thought that Americans were going to embrace socialism. They're not.
Yeah, I think one of the things that a lot of people missed was in a fairly recent TV appearance, he was explaining that, and I quote, "I'm a capitalist." Now, a capitalist, as we know, that's a term used by the people who oppose capitalism.
Yes.
Rather, he should, if he actually meant it, he should have said, "I'm a free marketeer," or "I believe in the free markets." So I think that actually, as you point out, the side that he sided with, the progressives, I think they took that as a challenge and are planning on crucifying him for.
Well, he gave them the rope. I mean, he encouraged them. He encouraged them to hold out and pass the bipartisan infrastructure bill. He should have pushed them to pass it before the 2021 election. Who passes a bill, a popular bill, a bipartisan bill, 1 day or 2 days after an election? That is political malpractice to a stunning degree. And a lot of it is Biden's responsibility because he's the party leader. And even if he's a doddering old fool, like a lot of us think he is the president. And he's the one that's got to make it happen. And he's just not doing it.
Yeah, it's. I guess a lot of the moderates they're campaigning more on issues, planning to campaign more on issues going into 2022 rather than relying on "We are Democrats, please re-elect us." So, what do the numbers tell us about those issues? I mean, it's notable in the aftermath of the election that you had the Fourth Estate allies telling the public that the adults were back in charge. That's what the legacy media thinks. But what do the American people think?
Well, there was a very revealing poll from Harris, old-time pollster. Gallup and Harris are probably the two oldest pollsters in the country. But the interesting part of it was not so much Biden's numbers now, because they're all underwater. The interesting thing was the contrast to Donald Trump's numbers in his last month in office. So remember that Trump had lost the election. His behavior had been extremely controversial. We had January 6th, which has been still being investigated. It was a horror show. And yet, you look at the numbers across the board comparing Trump in his last waning days of his presidency to Biden, and they're way up from where Biden stands now. 16 points lower is Biden on the economy. He is 14 points lower on job creation. I'm reading these off so I get them correct. He's 13 points lower on foreign affairs, 16 points lower on fighting terrorism, 17 points lower on immigration. And here's the part, Mark, that's really shocking. He's 7 points lower on the very thing that Biden apologists said was the reason to put him in for the bumbling, incompetent Donald Trump, was his competence. The fact that he's been a politician for 50 years and he's 7 points lower on the single issue, which you would think most people that voted for Biden voted on. And he's 7 points down there. So it's across the board a disaster. And I don't know, next time we see Donald Trump saying, miss me yet? Apparently, all the voters answering these polls miss his presidency, if not his person.
Yeah, there's been much analysis given in the wake of the stunning Virginia defeat, and to a lesser extent on the rising red tide in New Jersey. Now, do you think that, I mean, a lot of people are calling this like a semi-red wave or the burgeoning start of a red wave. Now, do you think that Joe Biden is the illness that's causing this, or is he just a symptom of a larger problem within the Washington, D.C. swamp?
Well, I think the radicals were allowed to run loose in this party in 2020. And I think because they won the election, they somehow thought that people want socialism and they don't object to the kind of insurrection, the real insurrection that we saw in the summer of 2020 when one city after another was taken over by radical Antifa activists and the like. They have gone forward somehow assuming that because Trump was not reelected, that means the country wants the opposite of Trump, which is pure, unadulterated socialism. Okay, European style more than Venezuelan style, but socialism nonetheless. They want it to be another Western Europe. That's what they want. So the fundamental premise that they're operating on is flawed, which is that the country is either center left or flat out left. And that just isn't true. The country is center right. And they're not comfortable with the radicals who seem to have taken charge of the Democratic Party. Even if AOC and the Progressive Caucus appear to be a minority, they are acting and they're being treated as if they're a majority. And you cannot tell me that more than 15, maybe 20% at most of the American people are comfortable with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez being in a position of power or authority. So I think it's a fundamental problem. And Biden's problem is that he's the best that the Democratic Party could do. And well, everybody,
That leads me nicely on to my final question for you, Tim. Now, you and I, we've discussed this before off camera, but it seems to me that Democrats, they're scrambling for a viable 2024 contender. Now, Kamala Harris is shockingly even more unpopular than her boss. I believe it's 28% approval rating. So who's left? Who will be on the Democrat 2024 ticket? And don't tell me it's Republican Adam Kinzinger.
Well, it could be.
Could be.
I mean, because look, they look through the field of all Democrats in the entire country, including the 29 who announced for the presidency in 2020. And the best they could come up with was Joe Biden, who 10 months into his presidency is at 38% approval, 3 separate polls, he's in the 30s. And Kamala Harris, who's 10 points lower than that. And all the other prospective Democrats, frankly, either disgraced themselves or gave a not ready for primetime performance in 2020, which lowers the number of potential candidates even that much further. I'll just say, Mark, if I had to guess, to me, the front runner in 2024 is going to be Gavin Newsom, because I believe he was strengthened by the recall effort in California, which he fended off easily. And I think in the tradition of that which does not kill me makes me stronger, I think Newsom, he's attractive, he's articulate, he's been wanting the presidency from the moment he entered public life. If I had to guess right now, I'm going with Gavin Newsom.
Tim Donner, thank you ever so much.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
Lawsuits aplenty against Travis Scott and the Astro World Music Festival. What happened and how will it play out in the courts? We'll be right back.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
The tragic deaths of 8 people and hundreds of injuries at the Astroworld Music Festival shocked the nation. Travis Scott, the performer, has come under the spotlight accused of performing while people were involved in a crush. And the legal consequences, the lawsuits, they have begun. Now, what kind of liability could Mr. Scott face? And does this have broader ramifications for performers in the future? Well, to answer these legal questions, we're joined by constitutional lawyer and host of the excellent Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott Cosenza. Thanks for taking
music
the time,
fan,
Scott.
Mark.
And music fan, a fan of Mr. Scott's.
And concert goer as well, yes.
Who's liable in this? What are the actions that provoke liability?
Well, there's a massive amount of attention focused on Travis Scott because he's the most famous or one of the most famous people there. But there is also the venue owner and the promoter of the show is usually how these things work, Mark. So if you or I wanted to rent out a stadium or arena for a venue, it's not like they just say, okay, we'll take the check and they hand over the keys. There's all sorts of liability protections that are required by a venue owner, including not only private security staff, but coordination often with state and municipal authorities for a venue of that size and a crowd that size. Then there's the promoter. Almost all of these events have a promoter who operates locally, okay? And they're in charge of actually dealing with the venue itself and selling the tickets and then sort of turning that over to the artists organization, which may be a corporate promoter. We have a lot of, trending now in the United States. I assume internationally this is true, but that instead of artists going on their own tour, that they or their label, their record label would promote, it would be like the LibertyNation.com, rap festival tour 2021. And so featuring, Travis Scott or Drake or such and thus. And so those people may also be liable. And then finally, we have the artists themselves, in this case, Mr. Scott and his potential liability.
Okay, so is it normal that people take legal actions against performers or venues or promoters when people get hurt at concerts? So surely things like crushes in the crowd, these are as old as rock and roll itself.
Well, that's certainly true. However, it is common if the allegations involve liability for the way that the venue was set up or the way that the show was designed, and whether that aided or retarded the damage. And so what we had, Mark, for a long time in the United States was the pit, if you call it, at the front of the shows. This is more common in heavy metal type shows. They were done away with because of liability in the courts that was assigned to artists and promoters when they basically said, well, this is sort of how the law works. If you know that there's a high likelihood of a pit developing or a crush developing and you do nothing about it, well, the first time it happens, maybe you're okay in terms of liability, meaning the first time in the country that this happens. But if it happens time after time and you don't do anything about it, well, then you may certainly incur liability. If I was advising somebody who was a concert promoter, I would certainly say you better take steps to manage this because it's a foreseeable problem. We don't have to protect against unforeseeable problems, like if an airplane came in and crashed in the crowd. But for this kind of thing, it is eminently foreseeable, and therefore, I think we're going to see a lot of liability there. If this is like the Full Lawyer Employment Act of 2021, Mark, this incident.
No job left behind. So now that the floodgates have opened on the lawsuits here, will this impact people being willing to put on shows or have their names associated with shows? I mean, artists and performers, they can just ditch the touring and they can make their money from album sales or downloads. So artists, are they going to be willing to put themselves in front of this kind of fire? Now, it's different, of course, for venues and promoters and labels, as you say. But is this going to impact how people access their entertainment?
Well, that is the design of the law. And what I mean by that, Mark, is when these people sue, they'll be suing for compensatory damages, but punitive damages is what they would be hoping to get. Now, punitive damages are damages designed to punish the person for their civil wrongdoing so that others may take heed and not do the same thing. So that's the precise design of the law, right? It's to say, oh, well, if Travis Scott got had to pay gazillions of dollars, I better not do this if I'm performer X. Okay. And that's my rap name now. So that is by design what should happen. Now, what would happen, I think, in effect, Mark, is what has happened in the past, which is that the concerts are designed to prevent that. So, for instance, in this case, there was a massive crush forward to the stage, as I understand it, to get closer to the stage. So what we have happened in many concerts, and I don't know why it wasn't in place here, is there are robust barriers in place to prevent that from happening. Now, certainly some person with acrobatic skill might be able to scale even the tallest fence, but there are ways to prevent almost every normal sort of person from getting that far forward. And that's what a lot of venues do when they expect this kind of a thing. So it would prevent this kind of crush, because the maximum amount of people couldn't get close to the stage to kind of enact the crush, if you will.
Yeah, there's been actually a lot of experts who are experts in crowd crushes and crowd size management. That these are roles that I wasn't aware specifically existed. Obviously, I was aware that risk management people existed, but crowd crush management experts, and they're saying that literally almost all concerts now have various things that they can be doing better. Now, are these experts who really nobody had really heard of beforehand, are they about to become the blazing faces of the media's coverage?
We got to get our resumes polished, Mark, for a crowd management consultant. Well, this is an important thing. If you're going to put on an event with many thousands of people, managing those people safely is incumbent upon you. If you're the organizer, those folks, yacht dealers, are going to be the benefit of some good sales coming up.
So tell me, in this instance, what is Mr. Scott's specific liability?
Well, that's a complicated question, Mark. It's confounded by a couple things. Number one is he seems to have a history, a public history through Twitter and social media of encouraging people to violate the safety precautions that have been established at his shows, encouraging people to jump on the stage, encouraging people to jump over barriers. And it remains to be seen whether he did so on the night in question in ways that, basically helped further the carnage. We know that he didn't stop the show amid pleas to stop the show. Now, what we don't yet know, Mark, is if he processed those as pleas to stop the show. You can imagine if you're on stage in front of, so many dozens and dozens of thousands of people, and some small universe of those people are screaming at you to do one thing, whether you're processing it as that thing, we just don't know. Perhaps he did. There are likely to be statements that he made to other people as he got off the stage that, are going to come out in court, and we'll learn about that. And if he did at the time know that there was, all these emergency incidents happening and he didn't do anything about it, well, then I think the liability would definitely apply. But all that's going to have to wait. We're going to be, for better or worse, talking about this for years to come, I think, because of all the legal action that will result.
And the world of concert going will change, and we'll all be at home in the metaverse watching things online. Scott D. Cosenza, thank you ever so much.
Thanks, Mark.
And that's about it for this week on Liberty Nation Radio. I want to thank our guest, the illustrious Cal Thomas, the fount of knowledge in all things political, Tim Donner, and of course our constitutional connoisseur, Scott Cosenza. And most of all, as always, my sincerest thanks to you, the listener, for being here. A final thought before we part. As Margaret Oliphant wrote in the Rector in 1863, he was highly spoken of, everybody knew, but nobody knew who had spoken highly of him. If that reminds you of the current president, it's because as the weeks and months pass, Joe Biden appears more a confection of media myths added to his own muddled personal history. Is it any wonder the American people have decided it's high time for a change? Thanks for listening.